Railroad Baron J.P. Morgan and Teddy Roosevelt, two of America's most colossal characters. And in 1901, history put them on a collision course when an assassin's bullet put an end to William McKinley's business-friendly presidency. Teddy Roosevelt became president, and he thought big business was getting too big. So when financier J.P. Morgan put together a mega deal to dominate America's railroads, Roosevelt's administration sued to stop it in its tracks.
It was really the first time that the government had held a company as prominent as Northern Securities and a man as powerful as Pierpont Morgan to account.
But in 1902, just as Roosevelt and Morgan were fighting each other in court, a crippling coal miner strike would force these two titans to help each other save the nation.
It was a moment where they both knew that what was at stake was more important than the conflict between the two of them.
It was the hour of fate. Susan Berfield, thanks very much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Paul. Really happy to be here.
The book was fascinating. The level of detail that you got into was amazing. But I'm wondering what drew you to this topic. Now, we know your day job, you're a reporter at Bloomberg. So I guess I could sort of see where that would be an attraction. But you've got these two stories in history that, for people who know a little bit about history, are fairly well known. But it's the combination, I guess, that's really more or less untold. What drew you to this story?
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I'm an investigative reporter at Bloomberg News, Bloomberg Business Week. So spent a lot of years looking at people who are in power, people who lose power, abuse power, and, who holds them to account. And so a couple of years ago, it was actually the beginning of the last election cycle. So 2016 seems like forever ago, but, there was a lot of talk about the progressive movement and, another moment in history where candidates were calling for certain progressive policies. And there seemed to be a kind of shift in the way people were thinking about things. And that got me just thinking about, the different points in history where this had been true. And eventually I decided to look at really the first time it was true, which was at the turn of the last century, and with two great characters, Theodore Roosevelt, J.P. Morgan. And so I thought I had the beginnings of an interesting story to focus on their relationship and what it meant for the country in the way that they were grappling with big issues.
Teddy Roosevelt was known as a reformer, but when he came to the presidency, quite by accident, as we'll talk about, the country was doing well. It was prosperous. Why did he want to mess with that?
Yeah. That is what Morgan asked him. I think he felt, and a lot of people felt that, with prosperity for some, came anxiety for others. So there were a lot of tensions in the country that prosperity couldn't solve, didn't necessarily create, but in some ways was exacerbating. And that's what Roosevelt saw, and that's what worried him. As you mentioned, he was an accidental president, came to power after William McKinley was assassinated by a former factory worker. And so, there was a lot of unease in the country and kind of worry about social unrest.
Typically, I think, after something like that happens and the country is rocked, the successor tries to follow path that the previous president was taking. Teddy Roosevelt, went in a completely different direction, much to the chagrin of many of the major characters of this story.
Yeah. He initially promised to follow McKinley's policies, kept McKinley's cabinet intact. But, anyone I think who had been paying attention to Roosevelt's career up to that point, which was most everybody in the country. He was really kind of celebrity president, even right at the start. Understood that he had made a career out of trying to improve government.
Did Teddy Roosevelt sort of see government as kind of a counterweight to capitalism?
Absolutely. Yeah, this was a time when, there was really it was the first very big businesses and also monopolies. And, everything was kind of becoming bigger. And Roosevelt felt like there sort of had to be big government to balance that.
Now, the other character, major character in the book, is J.P. Morgan, that people today know perhaps because of the name J.P. Morgan Chase and may not think so much about it as actually having been a person.
Yeah.
But he wasn't the richest man in America, but he was sure close to it. But he was probably, it seemed like, one of the most listened to.
I started researching the book knowing a lot less about Morgan. And I suspect most readers will, as you're suggesting, come to the book knowing a lot less about Morgan. And, what I found most interesting about him is that, he wielded incredible influence and power. And though he definitely had a lot of money, and that was important to him, and he spent it, in all sorts of ways that, we can see now. The Morgan Library is a fantastic place where I did a lot of research, and it's gorgeous. And he has an amazing collection of books and art. But he had a vision for America as an industrializing nation and taking its place in the world stage. And he wanted America to be a global power. And he thought he knew the best way to get it there. Roosevelt also wanted America to be a global power, and he thought he knew the best way to get it there. And their ideas were different. And that's kind of the clash and, the essence of the book. But so to your point, Morgan, had an inordinate amount of influence, in part because he controlled a lot of money, but in part because he had, at that point, a reputation for coming in and helping the country when it needed it.
The other two characters, so to speak, in the book that we could talk about quickly here are the railroads and the coal mines. The railroads at that time, that was the backbone of the country.
Yes. The railroads were, Amazon, Google, Facebook, all wrapped up in one. Everybody used them for everything. And they had been growing, with incredible speed, but also sort of recklessly, carelessly. A lot of them had gone bankrupt. They almost really caused two depressions. And Morgan had become invested in them, in part to save them. So he said, there was a phrase that a railroad had been Morganized. So rather than being reorganized, he kind of swooped in, brought his investors, put his people on the board of directors, and, controlled it from a remove. And Roosevelt understood, everybody understood the importance and the power of the railroads. And, like everything else, got a little worried when Morgan's control of them seemed too vast. The coal mines were connected to the railroads in the Northeast. And so that also led to another both conflict and episode of cooperation between the two of them.
Well, and now, drum roll, the hour of fate, where all of these things kind of coalesce. So Morgan resorted to a holding company to try to put all of these railroads together, which I guess was something that was coming into its own at that time, despite the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been, I guess, the decade before. Talk real briefly about holding companies and why these barons saw some usefulness to them.
As is always the case, when there's regulation, there's always a kind of counter move by the businesses that are being regulated. So in this case, the Antitrust Act comes into being. And so companies decide, okay, well, instead of trusts, let's form holding companies. They're essentially trusts. They're just called something else. And, Morgan formed a holding company for 3 railroads that would have dominated rail traffic in the Northwest. And once that company was formed, and it was formed just after Roosevelt came to office. And so it was in many ways kind of the perfect target. It was formed while Roosevelt was president. Morgan was involved, and Morgan was, among the most prominent businessmen, and it was railroads. And so from Morgan's point of view, it was like, what's not to love about this?
So that was Northern Securities, the holding company.
Yes. Yes.
And Teddy Roosevelt sued him.
Yeah. Yeah. So the government launched a case against Northern Securities. Morgan was very surprised and very unhappy, and went down to Washington to try to talk to try to talk Roosevelt out of it.
And
Did
did he say
not.
something like, have your people call my people and they'll do
Yeah,
lunch
he
and we'll
said,
get it all
yeah.
worked out?
Yeah, he was like, this is the kind of thing like presidents are supposed to discuss, with me. Like, you don't just surprise me like this. And really, all of Wall Street was shocked. No one had really ever tried to hold Morgan or anyone like Morgan to account before. And Roosevelt knew that. He understood the symbolic value of the case, as well as, the real economic value that it might have.
Speak softly and carry a big stick.
Yes.
Using the courts as his big stick. And so that
Yeah.
obviously put Roosevelt and Morgan at loggerheads. They're in court against each other. But at the same time, then, you've got this anthracite coal strike that's brewing and it comes to fruition. And of course, Morgan had interests in the coal mines too.
Yeah. So through his railroads, he kind of controlled, again from a remove, a lot of the anthracite coal, which was the main source of energy and fuel, and kind of had been responsible for America's industrialization. The miners, as we talked about, had been treated pretty badly for a while, and the United Mine Workers decided to try to organize. Eventually led to a strike in the spring of 1902. So just so Roosevelt took power in September. In February, he sues Morgan, and then in May, this strike begins. So Morgan is not the first person he's going to turn to for help with this. In fact, he is the last person he's going to turn to. He and his emissaries try all sorts of ways to get the coal miners and the coal owners to talk. Nothing happens through the summer into the beginning of the fall. And then things start to get a bit worrisome, where the post office says it's running out of coal. Factories say they're running out of coal and they're going to have layoffs. Schools are starting to close. People are starting to get a little cold, and they're also starting to burn another kind of coal, which is very polluting. And people are starting to get sick from that. And so, again, in the back of Roosevelt's mind is always the possibility of some kind of social unrest. The coal owners are very uncompromising, uninterested in talking at all. But Roosevelt does something that no president had ever done before, which is to try to mediate. And he calls both the union leader and the coal mine owners to Washington to talk. The union leader's thrilled about this, right? He gets to be in the room with Roosevelt and all of these men who he's been trying to talk to for months, and the coal mine owners are very annoyed that they're being summoned to Washington by a president who they don't really trust and who they think is a bit unpredictable. They do not agree that Roosevelt should be intervening, and they tell him really to his face that they are not going to settle this strike, that they are just going to let the miners, suffer, let Americans suffer, and, let the miners surrender. At that point, Roosevelt does two things. He drafts a very radical solution, which would be to send in U.S. Army soldiers to take over the mines, and kind of temporarily at least nationalize them. And though that sounds like a crazy idea, things were so desperate that a lot of other business leaders were suggesting he do just that. So it seemed like a real possibility. But before he was willing to do that, he decided he would try to persuade Morgan to talk to these guys. So Morgan had tried to stay out of it. didn't really like to get his hands messy with a lot of details like this. This was a complicated situation, and he just hoped that these coal mine owners could work it out with their employees. You know, obviously they were not interested in that, and so ultimately Morgan, with some members of Roosevelt administration, crafted a document that basically proposed exactly what the union leader had wanted, what Roosevelt had suggested, and what the mine owners had said they would never do, which was to allow Roosevelt to create an independent commission to hear the claims on both sides, and then to come up with basically a solution that would be binding. And so that's ultimately what happened.
So Roosevelt and Morgan, who were in court against each other, had to work together. Did they actually work together? It must have been sort of awkward.
Yeah, yeah. They did. I mean, they worked together in kind of the general sense of the word. Roosevelt sent one of his officials, Secretary of War, up to talk to Morgan. Morgan knew this fellow and trusted him, and they were the ones that crafted the agreement on Morgan's yacht, anchored off the waters around Manhattan, where reporters couldn't pry. And surprisingly, after they crafted the document, Morgan actually went down to Washington and presented it to Roosevelt. We don't know exactly what they said to each other, and they were not alone. And I'm sure it was brief. And Morgan, in the best of times, was sort of taciturn and didn't speak a lot. Roosevelt was very valuable, and I'm sure said something, but we don't know what. So, it was a moment where they both knew that what was at stake was more important than the conflict between the two of them.
They got this resolved, but the lawsuit was still going on. How did that finally end up?
Yeah, so the lawsuit was ultimately settled by the Supreme Court in March of 1904, and the government prevailed. And Roosevelt was thrilled. Of course, this also happened to be just about 8 months before the presidential election, so bonus for him. And I think the ultimate importance of the case, though it had some immediate, economic consequences, but more generally, it was really the first time that the government had held a company as prominent as Northern Securities and a man as powerful as Pierpont Morgan to account. And that helped Roosevelt both kind of soothe the nation. In a way, now people felt like the president was standing up for them, or was at least, willing to enforce laws against the powerful, that the laws and punishments were not just for those who weren't privileged. And, it also set the stage for the progressive era that began, I would say, more fully in Roosevelt's second term, but wouldn't have been possible without this victory and the way that the coal miners' strike was resolved.
And part of this case ended up working its way through the courts here in St. Louis for a time.
Yeah, that's right. They did have the first hearings in St. Louis, and that court ruled in favor. And then, of course, the railroad owners appealed to the Supreme Court.
So, in this whole scenario, then, what are you kind of defining as the hour of fate?
Well, I think it's really the moments when Roosevelt decides that he wants to bring kind of the full force of his office, of the presidency, to work on behalf of everyday people. He comes to call it offering a square deal. Franklin Roosevelt, his nephew, would create the New Deal, but Roosevelt's square deal was the sense that everyone should have an opportunity, if not an equal opportunity, at least a good opportunity, and that his job as president was going to be to not just make the rules more fair or enforce them more fairly, but to change the rules. And so I think that is kind of the defining moment.
Did this situation change Roosevelt at all? I mean, he was already sort of a reformer when he came into office, but at the same time, he wasn't that big on union labor, for instance. Did he grow from this experience?
He did. And, if you look at the whole arc of his political life, from where this book takes place mostly, to the end of his political career, he really becomes more progressive. Ultimately, kind of runs as a third party candidate in 1912, but he becomes more radical over time, actually. So with every elected office he held, he pushed things a little further. I know, which is kind of interesting and unusual.
I'm going to assume that J. Pierpont Morgan didn't really have a growth experience from this.
You would be correct.
Maybe he grew a little richer. They always seem to.
Yeah, no, I kind of describe him in the book as, having an aristocratic disdain for public sentiment. He really felt like he was above it all. He knew what was best and really just wished that kind of politicians and elected officials would just let him, do what he needed to do for himself and for the country.
Would it be fair to characterize this hour of fate as a turning point for both labor and commerce in this country, capitalism in this country?
Yes, yeah, I think so because, this was the beginning of the notion that, government could regulate business on the one hand and protect people also. So, Roosevelt in his next term created the Food and Drug Administration. He pushed for a kind of 8-hour workday. Ultimately he was talking about a living wage. So, everything he did for ordinary Americans had an effect on businesses and also required businesses to act in a different way. And so there wasn't really possible to do one without the other. It's two sides. But he was very focused on both, supervising businesses, making sure they did the right thing. And, and in the back of his mind, always that was so that people could be treated more fairly and things could be more equal.
It really led to the founding of the Commerce Department, among other things, right?
Exactly. I mean, the notion that there should be a bureaucracy sounds like a scary word, but that there should be people whose job it is to keep an eye on what business is doing.
As we sit here in the midst of the pandemic, I saw that you've written a piece just now about how the coal miners of that time were sort of the essential workers that we're talking about today. I'm wondering what the relevance of what happened at the hour of fate, how that applies today.
Well, I do think we're at a turning point of sorts, and the pandemic has both revealed it and exacerbated it. But, at least in the Democratic primaries, up until this point, there was a lot of talk about policies that Roosevelt had, brought up and thought about, and that, successive generations of politicians had also talked about, universal daycare, universal health care, very important now, a living wage, or at least a higher minimum wage, paid sick leave, all of those ideas kind of, come forth to the top of society at certain points, at crises. I mean, we had the Fair Deal, we have the New Deal. There were times when a crisis kind of made clear the inequities in American society and that are, inherent in American capitalism. And then, I think there's reforms, and Roosevelt started them, and then, capitalism doesn't stay reformed. Businesses find other ways. And so, there's reckonings every couple of years. So I do feel like we're at that point. And I think we were at that point, and I think the pandemic has made it even more clear that there's a lot of people in the country who, want, a new square deal. We can look back, and I think it's important to look back. It's, why I wrote the book. to see how things began, to see how things change, and to understand that, the very broad tensions in our society, still exist and probably will always exist, but like we have to try to ameliorate them.
Of course, we were all disappointed when you couldn't make it to St. Louis because, you can't do anything right now.
Yeah.
But people can still have a chance to interact with you about the book itself.
I'm so sorry I couldn't make it down there, but I have a website, susanberfield.com. And if you leave me a note on that with an inscription that you'd like, or if you want me to come up with something, I can send anyone who's interested a book plate.
Well, it's a fascinating read, I must say, and for particularly students of history who think they really know something about this period, I think even they will learn a lot from it. Susan Berfield, thanks very much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Roosevelt's private office, with olive burlap walls and matching curtains, had plenty of bookshelves, comfortable chairs, a divan, and a portrait of Abraham Lincoln over the fireplace mantel. Near his desk, he would hang a sonnet written years earlier by Kansas Senator John James Ingalls and sent to Roosevelt by his widow. It was called Opportunity. Master of human destinies am I knock unbidden once at every gate. If sleeping, wake. If feasting, rise. Before I turn away. It is the hour of fate.
I'm just an old coal miner and I labor for my bread. This story in my memory I've here told. Let the flowers be forgotten, sprinkle coal dust on my grave in remembrance of the UMWA.